Greetings everyone from Plymouth. I'm sorry I'm not with you today, and I'm sure you're having a wonderful time. I am at another event in Madrid with the Babson Collaborative, but I still wanted to share my research with you, which is focusing on refugees and entrepreneurship and the relationship between these two. So my name is Haya Al-Dajani, and I'm an associate professor in entrepreneurship at Plymouth University, and I also lead the Responsible Entrepreneurship and Social Innovation Research Group here in the Plymouth Business School. So to start off with for today then, looking at sort of this global refugee context, because it is a worldwide phenomenon, but it's also a worldwide concern and issue for not only refugees but everybody else. So according to the UNHCR, in 2017, there's around 65.6 million refugees who have been forcibly displaced from their homes to somewhere else. And of that 65.6 million, there's about 43.7 million who have been internally displaced within their own countries, and there's a further 21.9 million people who have actually had to leave their home countries and cross borders into other countries. What we tend to forget, or what the media tends to forget, is that actually 86% of that 21.9 million are actually displaced from one developing country to another developing country. They're not coming to Europe, they're not going to the US or Australia or elsewhere. Those who do are actually the minority of the population, the overall population of displaced people. And on this slide here, we can see the world's top 10 refugee host countries. So these are the countries that are receiving the refugees. And the ones highlighted or underlined in red, Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, are highlighted in red because those are the contexts that I'm focusing my research on. But as you can see, out of those 10 top refugee host countries around the world, 5 of them are actually located close to you in Central Africa. So Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Chad are all amongst the top 10 countries for hosting refugees. Interestingly also, and this is according to Amnesty International, these 10 of the world's 193 countries actually collectively shelter 56% of the world's 21.9 million. But even more pressingly, they account for less than 2.5% of the global economy. So the challenge here is not only for the refugees, but for the host countries and economies that host them. So focusing a little bit on the context in which I conduct my own research, Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, as you can see here from these figures, host not only Syrian refugees, but also those who came earlier, Iraqi refugees, and those who came much earlier, Palestinian refugees. And from the map here, you can see that these 3 host countries of Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey are very close to the hotspots from where refugees are coming: Iraq, Palestine previously, and Syria much more recently. What's also important, I think, to highlight here is the magnitude of the refugee population in relation to the host population. So in Jordan, for example, the overall population is about 9.5 million. However, almost a third of that population is made up of refugees. Similarly, in Lebanon, whose population is only around 6 million people, again, 1.5 of that 6 million is actually refugees. And then when we look at Turkey, we think, wow, they're actually hosting 2.5 million refugees, but their population is almost 80 million people. So in some ways that 2.5 million refugees gets dispersed and gets hidden in the wider population. But in countries like Jordan and Lebanon, the refugee populations are so much more prominent because they are making up almost a third of the country's populations. So within that context, I was fortunate enough to receive an ESRC research grant, and the ESRC is the UK Research Council, or one of the UK Research Councils, and it's the Economic and Social Research Council, and they funded this project, which is a 3-year project from 2016 to 2019, and the project looks at poverty alleviation and women refugees in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. And we're looking at whether or not this sort of grassroots micro-entrepreneurship empowers those women or not. The partners on the project are Plymouth University as well as Nottingham University, the Hayden Green Institute for Entrepreneurship and Innovation there, and we also have 3 partners across the 3 different countries where the research is being undertaken. So in Jordan, the partner is the King Hussein Foundation Information Research Center. In Lebanon, the partner is the Issam Faris Institute at the American University of Beirut. And in Turkey, our partner is UDA Consulting. And if you'd like to learn more about this project, there's the website for the project there, and we also have a Twitter hashtag which is at Refugee Women, so please feel free to explore more on the website and to follow the Twitter. In terms of the theoretical or the conceptual framework informing this project, we're very much looking at the empowerment aspects of the refugees, and we're looking at how this can be enabled through their engagement in entrepreneurship within their context of displacement. And in terms of methodology, as I said earlier, the project began in 2016 and will be finishing in 2019, so we are almost 2/3 of the way. So in each of the 3 countries, we hosted a stakeholder engagement focus group discussion to kickstart the data collection. And the reason for doing so is because there's actually very little published or available data around refugee entrepreneurship in these 3 countries. So it was important for us to engage the stakeholders, to learn more from them about what's happening at the grassroots level currently, and also to inform them about the project itself, because we wanted to engage the stakeholders really to be as partners for the future, because once a project is over, that's only then the beginning of the work that can be done with the refugees. And so the data we collected from the focus group discussions in each of the countries was then used to inform the individual interviews that we would do with the refugee women. So in some ways, as the research team, we were the go-between the stakeholders and the refugees. And in each of the 3 countries again, so in Lebanon, in Jordan and in Turkey, we conducted 50 interviews with Iraqi, Palestinian and Syrian women. So in the overall sample of refugees, we had 150 individual interviews with displaced Iraqi, Palestinian and Syrian women in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. And all that data collection has been completed. What we then did with that data is take it back to the stakeholders. So we invited the stakeholders to come back to a second focus group discussion, and these were held in October of 2017. And what we did was really to share the preliminary overall outcomes and observations from that first round of data collection with the refugee women. And again, we were able to collect more insights from the stakeholders about these findings, but we also asked them to share with us what actions, if any, they would be taking on after leaving the focus group, the second focus group discussion, of what they would do differently in their organizations now that they are actually informed about the realities of these 150 women. We're not able to share that particular data with you as yet, because we will go back to the stakeholders again in the summer of 2019 to follow up on what actions have been implemented or not, and so we'll be able to share that data at a later stage. But where we are now with the data collection is the follow-up survey with the refugee women. So we had the focus group discussions originally. We did the qualitative data collection with the refugee women in the summer of 2017. We had the focus group discussion, second one, with the stakeholders in October, and now we are about to undertake the follow-up survey with the same refugee women that we interviewed in the summer of 2017. So the idea is really to see what has happened in the period between us interviewing them last summer and where we will be following up with them next summer. So I won't dwell too much on this particular slide, but it's really to give you a flavor for the sample that we have in our study at the moment. So you can see that in all three countries we were able to conduct interviews with the Iraqi, Palestinian and Syrian women. But what we hadn't anticipated in our design originally was looking at the Palestinian refugees who came from Syria. So in our sample, we had accounted for Palestinians who were displaced from their countries of origin, but we hadn't accounted for the Palestinian refugees coming from Syria. And we were very fortunate that we were able to include 10 of these participants in Lebanon, because they are double refugees. You know, these are people who were living in Syria as refugees, as Palestinian refugees, and now have been displaced again to Lebanon as Palestinian Syrian refugees. So I'm able to share with you some preliminary findings at this stage, because as you can imagine, with the volume of data, we've yet to complete the analysis fully. But what we found really was that the vast majority of the participants are, maybe unsurprisingly, engaging in very feminized sectors. So here we have three different images that came from the participants' businesses. The Singer machines on either side of the slide are home-based. So these were home-based enterprises, and the one in the middle is very much a micro-enterprise that is operating in an area in Lebanon, so it's not home-based. But clearly these are the types of enterprises that are capitalizing on the women's skills, and these are skills that they largely learned at home from their mothers. Again, these examples come from Turkey, in the south of Turkey, and what we see here are again examples of feminized businesses, so businesses that are run by women and catering to women's needs. These are businesses that are set up to serve the refugee population itself. They're not there for the Turkish or the host community. So even in very poor neighborhoods in southern Turkey that are dominated by Syrian refugees, the women still want to buy their makeup, they still need to have their hair done, they're still getting married and having all these occasions. So again, these three businesses here are not home-based, but run by refugee women. And another example here are sort of very necessity-based businesses, again catering for the refugee population itself. So these are your typical sort of corner shops or shops, full stop, grocery stores in refugee camps or areas where there is a huge population of refugees just not living in a camp. But what we found with these types of businesses is that they are run by a husband and wife, by co-preneurs rather than by the women on their own. And whilst they look very disorganized, actually for the owners they are very organized. They know exactly where everything is, and when you walk into the shop and ask for what you want, they can serve you super quick. One aspect we found surprising in this particular study was actually a small number of registered and formal types of businesses. So the three previous slides were very much examples of businesses run by refugees for refugees and very much existing in the informal economy. These, however, are still run by refugee women, but they are very much operating within the formal sector and they are catering to the host population. One of the images there on the bottom of the slide is actually the certificate of registration which the refugee woman was very proud of getting. Now, when we had these examples, we're trying to find out, well, how is it that these particular women were able to formalize their businesses and have them registered, unlike the vast majority of the others? Clearly, the answer was that these particular women were able to find business partners from the host population. So in terms of our very preliminary thematic analysis, we have three emergent themes which I would like to share with you today. And the first one is around this notion of displacement. So I have a couple of quotes here. The first one comes from a lady a Palestinian refugee lady in Lebanon, and she's saying, "I was born here and have lived here for more than 50 years, but I will never know my home or where I'm supposed to be from." So she's identified as a refugee in her host nation. She's supposed to be a refugee, but she was actually born in Lebanon and has always lived in her host country. The second quote here, which again presents a very different experience of displacement, comes from a Syrian refugee lady displaced to Turkey. And she says, 5 years ago we were a family of 8 living in one home in Syria. Now I'm here with my disabled husband and 2 children. 2 of my other children are in different places in Turkey. My daughter is with her children in Syria, they can't get out. And my son is missing. We haven't heard from him in 1.5 years. So both are examples of displacement accounts and are plentiful within our data set. But I thought these particular 2 quotes show 2 very distinct experiences of displacement. With regards to gender and how gender norms are changing within these communities, one particular woman was saying, I'm not a woman anymore, because in her eyes, as growing up as a young girl in her family and in her country, she was expecting that she would grow up to be cared for and looked after by a loving husband, that she would not be a main breadwinner trying to make ends meet for her and her family. So her expectations of what a woman should be have been completely shattered by the experiences that she's facing as an adult woman. And then the second quote here is, I'm stronger than 10 men. And this is another lady who actually is seeing the positive changes in the gender norms and the gender relations. And she's saying that actually through her displacement experience and through her entrepreneurship, she can do a lot more and be much more effective than 10 men put together. And then finally, in terms of our third theme and looking at entrepreneurship, well, again, we see two varying or two distinct responses. One is that, through my enterprise, I provide for my children and my sick husband. So it's a very typical necessity-driven micro-enterprise for particular purpose of alleviating poverty. And then the second one is again at the other end of the spectrum, where they're saying, it's very hard work, but actually worth every effort. So they were looking at it in a much more positive light, and so something that perhaps is done by choice rather than by need. In regards then to some of these quotes and some of the businesses that we identified through our sample, again, I'm sorry, but these remain very preliminary findings. We have a number of conclusions as such that we want to think about a little bit more and analyze a little bit further. And the first one is about sort of these gender borders as such, and how they're changing amongst refugee communities. But really, do these changes empower the refugee women? And if so, in what ways? Are we simply asking refugee women to do more, more than they're already doing? And in what ways does that empower them? Or should we actually be empowering them in different ways and having them do less in terms of the expected responsibilities? The second theme is about the types of businesses that these women are engaging in. So some refugee women can conquer these so-called prosperity borders on their own, but as we saw, the vast majority cannot. So those very few examples of women formalizing their businesses, registering their businesses, how can they do it, and why can't the others not? Is another theme that we want to explore a little bit further. Thirdly, we're looking at refugee women's enterprises and how they will actually continue perhaps to provide this so-called safe facade for poverty alleviation and empowerment. In many ways, what we saw or what we still see are actually women or refugee women running tiny micro-enterprises. And at the same time, they're not making much money out of these enterprises, but are having to invest their time and their effort and their resources extensively in them, as well as maintaining and managing all their other family and social obligations and responsibilities. At the same time, they're under huge threat from authorities because their businesses are informal and illegal. So whilst we are trying to encourage more and more women to engage in entrepreneurship and in enterprise startup, I think we have to be a bit more careful and conscious about the consequences of those potential actions, and how can we do it in a way that really is empowering rather than pretending to be so. And then, looking at whether entrepreneurship actually offers a pathway to navigating the borders of prosperity, but also identity. So many of the participants we saw in our research are not only looking at potentially poverty alleviation or wealth creation, but it's about looking at means and ways through which their entrepreneuring can help them maintain their identity as women, their identity as Palestinian women or Iraqi women or Syrian women, rather than as refugees. And then, of course, we want to look at the role of the aid agencies in all of this. We know that the vast majority of refugees are cared for by aid agencies, whether national or international aid agencies, in their host nations. So the aid agencies have a huge role to play here, but they also face limitations in their resources, and their resources are shrinking too. So in what ways can their role be more impactful and effective when they bring on agendas for entrepreneurship and enterprise startups? And finally, I thought it might be useful to have a look at how maybe this research is relevant to Ghana and to the Ghanaian context. So one question that I would love to explore if I had been with you is looking at maybe how gender norms are also changing in Ghana, and how do these changes actually empower women entrepreneurs there. I know they're not refugees, but they are still women. And on that notion then, so how can refugee women actually offer, how can refugee entrepreneurship offer wealth creation rather than poverty alleviation? And the reason why I separate between these two terms is that poverty alleviation is simply about being less poor, and wealth creation is about being more wealthy. And we all know the two are quite different. And then the question about how entrepreneurship offers a pathway to navigating the borders of identity and prosperity. For who? For both men and women? For which men? For which women? How can they do this? And I don't know how many refugees you have in Ghana, but is that a priority there, or is it about looking at different classes and different socioeconomic groupings in Ghana? And then, of course, the role of the aid agencies in Ghana and how they do or can enable entrepreneurship. And again, be these local aid agencies or international aid agencies. And then finally, I've tried to share with you as much as possible the research methodology that my colleagues and I have been adopting in our research. But I don't know how you feel about how research is already being conducted and whether it needs to be done differently. Certainly we want our research to have more impact, not only on the individuals or the participants who participate in our research, but more broadly within the economy, especially since we are researching entrepreneurship. So it's looking at means and ways in which we can design our methodologies differently and perhaps engage more stakeholders and more types of stakeholders in the research that we do. So on this point, I think I'd like to thank you for listening to this, and I want you to enjoy the rest of the conference and maybe think about those points for discussion. And if you'd like to get in touch, please do so. I look forward to hearing from you. Many thanks.